A powerful billionaire once used his wealth and influence to crush an innocent soul. Charles Whitmore, owner of Whitmore Industries, accused his loyal maid, Sophia Hale, of stealing a priceless heirloom, a gold pocket watch that had belonged to his late father. It was a crime she didn't commit, yet Charles ensured she'd be condemned. With the help of a corrupt friend, Judge Preston, Sophia was sentenced to 15 years behind bars. No evidence, no fair trial, no mercy. The world believed she was guilty. Everyone except one, Ethan Whitmore, Charles's 6-year-old son. What that little boy discovered would one day shatter a web of deceit, shake the very system that condemned her, and change all their lives forever. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video and comment below where you're watching from. We love knowing that. Charles Whitmore woke before sunrise that morning, a habit formed on days that mattered most. Today was one of them. He had a private investors gathering at Whitmore Manor, the grand estate perched above Ravenshire's hills. Every detail had to be immaculate. The lawns trimmed, the marble shining, the air scented with roses imported from France. Charles wanted perfection, not just to impress, but to remind his guests that the Whitmore name carried legacy, power, and control. He walked through the long corridors of the manor, the sound of his footsteps echoing across marble. The staff moved quietly, trays clinking, curtains being drawn, silver polished till it gleamed. In the kitchen, the head chef prepared a menu fit for royalty. Everything looked perfect. Before meeting his guests, Charles paused by the private study room, a place he rarely let others enter. It was his sanctuary, filled with relics, family portraits, and first editions collected across decades. But what mattered most stood in a glass case at the center of the room, his father's gold pocket watch. Every morning before a major event, Charles looked at that watch for courage. It reminded him of the man who'd built everything he now ruled. The heirloom symbolized not just wealth, but lineage, the invisible thread that tied him to his past. But that morning, as Charles stepped closer to the case, he froze. The glass door stood slightly open. The watch, gone. He blinked hard, thinking his eyes deceived him. He checked the desk, the shelves, the cabinet. Nothing. No note, no explanation. His heartbeat quickened, blood rushing to his temples. That watch had never left that case. Not once. He rang the bell sharply. Within minutes, the house staff gathered, maids, guards, and the butler, Mr. Allen. "Who entered this room today?" Charles demanded. Faces turned pale. No one dared to speak. He repeated the question louder. Finally, a maid spoke softly. "Sir, only Sophia was in here this morning. She dusted the shelves as usual." Sophia Hale, quiet, diligent, the one woman everyone trusted. Charles sent for her immediately. Sophia entered, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. Her soft brown eyes showed confusion. She'd served the Whitmore family for years, through birthdays, funerals, and lonely nights when the house felt too heavy. She'd never once been accused of anything. "Did you touch the case?" Charles asked. "No, sir," she replied, voice trembling. "I didn't even notice it was open. I only cleaned around it." Charles's expression hardened. His jaw tightened as emotion clashed with suspicion. "You expect me to believe that? That the most valuable thing in this room just vanished?" Her hands shook. "Sir, please, I would never." "Enough," Charles snapped. His voice cut through the room like glass. The others froze. "You betrayed this house, Sophia. You betrayed me." Sophia's eyes welled with tears, but she stayed still. "I haven't, sir." He didn't listen. Rage had already decided for him. "You're dismissed. Immediately." The guard stepped forward, escorting her toward the door. Sophia walked in silence, head bowed, tears threatening to fall. As the iron gates of Whitmore Manor closed behind her, she turned once, looking back at the house she'd called home for years. Everything she'd worked for was gone. No proof, no defense, only shame. Charles ordered the police to be called. He demanded an official report, extra cameras, tighter locks. No more trust, he muttered under his breath. By the time guests arrived that evening, the mansion looked polished again, but its soul wasn't. The party went on. Laughter filled the halls, champagne sparkled in crystal glasses, and classical music echoed softly through the grand foyer, but Charles barely heard any of it. He stood by the study door, staring at the empty glass case. The missing watch left more than a space on the shelf. It left a wound inside him, and though no one realized it yet. That wound would start a tragedy that would haunt them all. After the disappearance of the watch, Charles Whitmore wasted no time. He was not a man of patience or second chances. In his world, appearances mattered more than truth. And that morning, he'd already decided who would bear the blame. He picked up the phone and called his old friend, Judge Preston, a man whose loyalty was measured in favors, not justice. "I want this case closed by tonight," Charles said, voice cold, clipped and final. Within hours, calls were made. Connections were pulled. A private trial was quietly arranged at Ravenshire Courthouse. No investigation, no forensics, no proper questioning. Charles's word alone carried enough weight to condemn a life. Sophia Hale was arrested that same afternoon. She didn't even understand why at first. She had only just returned home, still trying to process the humiliation of being fired. The officers arrived with papers, accusations and handcuffs. The neighbors watched from behind curtains. In minutes she was taken away, her cries muffled against the car window. Inside Greywood Correctional Facility's intake hall, the world felt colder. The air smelled of iron and disinfectant. Sophia sat silently as her fingerprints were taken. A part of her wanted to scream that it was a mistake, but no one listened. The system had already chosen its side. By evening, she stood in front of the courtroom doors, trembling. A single thought echoed in her mind. Why won't anyone believe me? The courtroom was half full when the trial began. Charles Whitmore sat proudly near the front, his suit pressed, his face expressionless. Judge Preston, sitting high above, wore his black robe with quiet arrogance. The spectators whispered, sensing a show rather than a search for truth. Sophia's lawyer, a weary public defender who had met her just an hour before, barely looked up from his papers. "State your name," the judge said. "Sophia Hale," she answered, voice barely audible. "Occupation?" "I was employed as a maid at Whitmore Manor." The words "was employed" pierced her like a blade. Charles stood next, his confidence filling the room. "Sophia Hale was a trusted employee," he began, until greed got the better of her. His voice carried the authority of a man whose money could rewrite laws. "The watch she stole wasn't just gold. It was a legacy, my father's memory." He looked at the judge as if to remind him of shared history, the lunches, the deals, the mutual secrets. Judge Preston gave a slow nod. Sophia tried to speak, but her lawyer tugged her sleeve, signaling silence. The defense had no evidence, no witness, no power. The prosecution had influence, and that was enough. The judge's tone softened when he spoke to Charles, but sharpened when he turned to her. "You had access to the room?" "Yes, sir, but that will be all." He cut her off before she could finish. Sophia lowered her head. Her hands trembled in her lap. She felt like she was sinking, every breath pulling her deeper into a place where truth no longer mattered. Charles continued, speaking with rehearsed grief. "She was loyal once, but temptation is a dangerous thing. I treated her like family, and this is how she repaid me." Murmurs spread through the courtroom. People nodded without thinking. No one questioned the holes in his story. No one asked for proof. Within 40 minutes, the trial was practically over. There was no evidence, only his accusation and her silence. Judge Preston glanced at his papers, sighed dramatically, and said the words that would break her world. "This court finds the defendant, Sophia Hale, guilty of grand theft, sentenced to 15 years in Greywood Correctional Facility." Sophia froze. The sound of her own heartbeat drowned everything else. "No," she whispered. "Please, I didn't—" But the guards had already stepped forward. Chains clinked. The room blurred as tears filled her eyes. She looked once toward Charles, the man who'd ruined her life, but his face showed nothing. No guilt, no doubt, just satisfaction. The gavel struck. The verdict echoed like thunder. Sophia's knees weakened. As the guards led her away, she looked around the room. Faces she had served tea to, people who once smiled when she passed. None met her eyes. At the back of the courtroom, a small figure sat quietly, Ethan Whitmore, age 6. He'd been brought by his nanny, Clara, to watch his father's important hearing. No one paid him attention, but Ethan's wide blue eyes saw what adults ignored. He saw Sophia's shaking hands. He saw her whisper, "I didn't do it." He saw the way his father looked proud instead of sad, and though his young mind couldn't name it, he recognized something wrong in that silence. When the guards pushed the door open and Sophia disappeared behind it, Ethan's heart sank. He'd known her all his short life. She was the one who brought him cookies after bad dreams, who patched his torn shirts, who called him sweet boy. Why would someone kind do something cruel? That night, as the limousine drove home, Ethan sat quietly beside Clara Whitmore. Charles spoke with his lawyer, already planning the headlines. "Billionaire restores family honor." Ethan looked out the window. The city lights blurred into tears. He didn't understand the law or lies. He only understood one thing: the world had just punished the wrong person. He turned to his mother. "Mom," he said softly, "did Sophia really steal it?" Clara hesitated. Her eyes flickered toward Charles, then back to her son. "Don't ask questions, sweetheart," she whispered. "It's better that way." But Ethan didn't stop thinking. He couldn't. Back in his bedroom at Whitmore Manor, he sat on his bed, hugging his knees. He replayed every moment. His father's voice, the way the judge didn't listen, the way Sophia cried, the house that once felt warm now felt colder, quieter. Down the hall, Charles toasted with his guests, satisfied that his family name was safe. But upstairs, a 6-year-old boy stared out his window, watching the rain fall on the manor gates where Sophia had last stood. And in that silent moment, a promise began to form in his young heart. He didn't know how or when, but one day he would find the truth. After the trial, Sophia Hale was taken to Greywood Correctional Facility, a place where sunlight felt like a privilege. The first nights were endless. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't stop hearing the gavel that had sentenced her. The walls smelled of bleach and rust, the air thick with hopelessness. She sat alone on her bed, staring at her trembling hands. Her body was there, but her spirit refused to die. Somewhere deep inside, she still clung to the truth. "I didn't do it." When the guards weren't looking, she prayed silently, for strength, for justice, for someone to listen. Then, one afternoon, while cleaning the prison corridor, a thought came to her. Grace Ellison. Grace had been her childhood friend. Back then, they'd shared secrets, laughter, and dreams of escaping their small town. Grace grew up to become a forensic expert, sharp, determined, fearless. They hadn't spoken in years, but if there was anyone who could help uncover the truth, it was her. That night, Sophia borrowed a small piece of paper and a dull pencil from the guard's desk. She wrote a letter. Her handwriting shook, but every word carried her heart. "Grace, they took everything from me. They said I stole something sacred. I didn't. You're the only one who might believe me." Days passed before the reply came. The prison guard handed her a sealed envelope. Inside, Grace's handwriting was clear and firm. "I believe you. I'm coming." When the next visiting day arrived, Sophia was escorted to the outdoor meeting area, a place surrounded by barbed wire, yet filled with the faint scent of rain-soaked grass. Grace was waiting near the gate. Her eyes widened when she saw her friend. Sophia looked thinner, weaker, but there was still fire behind those tired eyes. They hugged, a long, trembling embrace between two women who had survived too much. Inside the visitation room, they sat across from each other. Grace listened as Sophia spoke, her voice fragile yet desperate. She described the missing watch, the open glass case, the one-sided trial, and the 15-year sentence that had crushed her. Grace didn't interrupt. She took notes quietly, her sharp mind piecing together details like shards of glass. Then Sophia mentioned something small, something she hadn't realized mattered until now. There was a white cloth, she said slowly. It was always on top of the glass case. The day they said the watch disappeared, that cloth was gone too. Grace leaned forward. Gone? You're sure? Yes. It was there the night before. The next morning, missing. Grace's mind started connecting threads. If someone used that cloth to pick up the watch, they might have left traces. Sweat, skin, even blood. Sophia frowned. Blood! Maybe, if they were nervous or cut themselves. And if the cloth wasn't washed, the DNA could still be there. Hope flickered in Sophia's eyes, small but real. For weeks she'd been treated like nothing. Now for the first time she felt seen. Grace squeezed her hand. If we find that cloth, I'll test it myself. I still have my old equipment. You're not alone anymore. Sophia's voice broke. Thank you, Grace. You're all I have left. Grace smiled softly. Then let's fight. But what neither of them knew was that someone else had been listening. Just beyond the wall, hidden behind a tree near the fence, stood Ethan Whitmore. The 6-year-old had followed Sophia that morning after overhearing whispers between servants about her getting a visitor's pass. He didn't tell anyone. He just wanted to know more, to understand why his heart still hurt when he thought of her. When he saw her through the fence, his small hands gripped the bars. His breath fogged the glass as he watched her sit with a stranger, a woman who spoke with intensity and care. Ethan couldn't hear everything, but one word carried through the wind: cloth. The white cloth. It sparked something deep in his memory. He remembered seeing it, folded neatly on the display case, then later somewhere else, tossed carelessly. He couldn't recall where exactly, but he knew it mattered. He crouched lower, listening as fragments of conversation reached him. DNA, blood, proof. And then, suddenly, it clicked. He had seen that cloth again days after Sophia was arrested. In the laundry room, stained faintly red and forgotten in a basket near the back stairs. He didn't know what it meant, but his heart told him one thing. Sophia had told the truth. As the guards called for visiting hours to end, Ethan stepped back, eyes wide with realization. He didn't want to be caught. Sophia stood, hugged Grace one last time and whispered, "I'll wait for your word." Grace nodded. "I'll find it." Whatever it takes, Ethan turned and ran. His small shoes splashed through puddles as he hurried back toward Whitmore Manor, his mind racing faster than his legs. He didn't know yet how he'd do it, but he was going to find that cloth. The next morning, before the sun rose, Ethan slipped quietly out of bed. The house was still asleep. He tiptoed through the corridors, the sound of his heartbeat louder than his footsteps. He reached the home office, a room filled with silence and secrets. His father's trophies glinted in the dim light. The smell of cigar smoke lingered faintly. He hesitated at the door, remembering his father's rule, never enter without permission. But this was different. He wasn't playing anymore. Slowly, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. Every breath felt heavy as he searched the room. And then he saw it, a folded white cloth tucked behind a cabinet drawer. His hands trembled as he reached for it. The fabric was soft, but stained with a dark, dried blotch. At first, he thought it was wine, but when he brought it closer, the metallic scent told him otherwise. Blood. And suddenly, a memory flashed. His sister Lydia, walking quickly down the hall days before the theft, holding something wrapped in white cloth, her face pale, her movements hurried. He remembered asking, "What's that?" and her answering, "Nothing. Go play." Now, standing in that silent room, the truth settled cold in his chest. It wasn't Sophia. It had never been Sophia. Someone else had taken the watch. And in doing so, they'd left a piece of themselves behind. Ethan folded the cloth carefully, hiding it inside his jacket. His hands shook, but his decision didn't. He had to take it to Grace. She would know what to do. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was the only one who could bring back the truth. When Ethan Whitmore returned home that morning, the sun had barely touched the hills of Ravenshire City. His small hands were still trembling from what he'd seen. The white cloth lay hidden under his jacket, pressing against his chest like a heartbeat. He slipped through the side door of Whitmore Manor, unnoticed. The staff were busy preparing breakfast, their chatter filling the distant halls. His father's voice echoed faintly from the dining room, calm, confident, unaware of the truth his 6-year-old son carried. Ethan moved quietly, each step deliberate. He reached his bedroom and shut the door, locking it behind him. The moment the latch clicked, his courage collapsed. His breath came fast, his eyes wet. He pulled the cloth out from under his jacket. It looked harmless, ordinary. But the dried red stain at the edge told another story. He laid it on his bed and stared. The fabric smelled faintly of metal and dust. His tiny fingers brushed the corner where the stain had darkened. He didn't know the word evidence, but he understood what it meant. Proof. Ethan's thoughts tangled between fear and determination. If his father found out he had entered the office, there would be trouble. But if he did nothing, Sophia would stay in prison, punished for something she hadn't done. He wiped his tears with his sleeve and whispered, "I'll fix it, Sophia. I promise." That night, during dinner, Charles Whitmore sat across from his children, his voice as sharp and measured as ever. The chandeliers glowed above them, crystal light glittering against polished silverware. "Ethan," he said suddenly, "why do you look distracted?" Ethan froze. The fork in his hand trembled. "I'm just tired," he replied softly. Charles studied him for a moment, then continued talking about investors and construction projects, the kind of things a 6-year-old couldn't care about. But Lydia Whitmore, seated beside her brother, barely touched her food. Her movements were stiff, her face pale. Ethan noticed the small bandage wrapped around her right hand. Thin, white, and too precisely placed to be accidental. Their eyes met for a brief second, and she looked away immediately. That was enough, he knew. When dinner ended, Charles rose from the table and walked toward the Home Office. Lydia excused herself and went upstairs without a word. Ethan remained seated, staring at his plate until the servants cleared it away. Later, when the house went quiet, Ethan crawled into bed but couldn't sleep. The cloth lay hidden beneath a pile of books under his mattress. Every creak of the hallway made him flinch, afraid someone might discover it. But the next morning, before dawn, he made his decision. He would take it to Grace Ellison, the woman Sophia had met at the prison. Ethan didn't know her personally, but he remembered hearing her name when Sophia spoke it to the guards. He took a deep breath, packed the cloth into a small tin box, and slipped it into his backpack. Downstairs, he found a few coins from his birthday jar, enough to pay for a taxi. By the time the city began to wake, Ethan was already on the road. The streets of Ravenshire blurred past the window as he sat quietly, clutching the tin box on his lap. When the car stopped outside Willow Creek Cottage, the driver looked at him curiously. "You sure this is the place, kid?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, sir." He stepped out, heart pounding, and walked toward the small wooden gate. The garden was wild but beautiful, full of ivy and sunlight. He knocked softly on the door. Moments later, Grace opened it, surprised to see a small boy standing alone on her porch. "Ethan?" she asked, recognizing him from Sophia's description. He nodded, eyes wide. "I think I found something." Inside, the room smelled of coffee and books. Grace guided him to the table, where papers and test tubes lay scattered. Ethan placed the tin box down and opened it. The white cloth rested inside, folded carefully. "This was in my father's office," he whispered. "And I think it's the same one Sophia talked about." Grace leaned forward, examining it with professional focus. When she saw the dark stain, her breath caught. "You're brave for bringing this," she said softly. "Do you know what this means?" Ethan shook his head. "Only that it proves she didn't do it." Grace smiled faintly, a sad, admiring smile. "It might. If the DNA on this isn't hers, it could change everything." She picked up a pair of tweezers and carefully lifted the fabric. "This could have traces of blood." "That's what we'll test." Ethan watched, hands clasped tightly. He didn't blink. Grace continued. "It'll take a few days to get results, but we'll keep it safe. I'll send it to someone I trust." "Will my dad find out?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, then knelt to meet his eyes. "Not if we're careful." For the first time since the trial, Ethan smiled, small but real. "Sophia will be free," he whispered. Grace touched his shoulder gently. "You remind me of her, strong when no one's watching." Later that day, she sealed the cloth in an evidence bag and prepared a discreet shipment to an old colleague at a private lab. No names, no trails, just a small note, "Urgent retest." Meanwhile, Ethan returned home, trying to act normal. He walked through the grand foyer just as Charles Whitmore entered from a meeting. His father's gaze swept over him. "You've been outside?" "Yes, sir," Ethan answered quietly. "Next time, tell your mother first." Charles' tone was strict but distracted. He didn't notice the faint relief on his son's face. That night, Ethan sat by his window again. He looked out toward the city lights, whispering a prayer that the truth would come fast. Down the hall, Lydia Whitmore paced her room. Her hands shook. The bandage on her palm had begun to stain faintly red again. She pressed her fingers against it, eyes wide with fear. Her father might have thought the problem was gone, but Lydia knew the truth was still breathing, quietly, dangerously, inside the same house, and in another part of Ravenshire. Grace Ellison stared at the sealed envelope resting on her desk, ready to be mailed. She exhaled slowly and said to herself, "Hold on, Sophia. We're coming." Days passed in silence, but for Ethan Whitmore, every minute felt like an hour. He went to school, smiled when spoken to, and pretended everything was normal. But his mind never stopped replaying that moment in Grace Ellison's cottage, the white cloth sealed in an envelope that might carry the truth. Each night, when the house fell quiet, Ethan would sit by the window, watching the moonlight touch the Whitmore Manor gates, the same gates that had once closed behind Sophia Hale. Downstairs, his father still moved through life as if nothing had changed. Charles Whitmore hosted dinners, took calls from investors, and signed documents with steady hands. The trial had given him a strange sense of victory, a way to prove that even rumors couldn't touch his reputation. But beneath the polished marble and wealth, the house felt different. The air was heavier now. Conversations ended quickly when footsteps approached. Even the staff whispered in corners instead of laughing. And then there was Lydia. She barely left her room anymore. Her meals went untouched. She spent hours sitting at her desk, staring at nothing. When anyone mentioned Sophia's name, she flinched. The guilt she carried had begun to change her, eating away at her voice, her smile, her peace. Sometimes, Ethan passed her door late at night and heard soft sobs through the wood. But he said nothing. He wasn't ready to confront her yet. He was waiting for proof. Meanwhile, across the city, Grace Ellison was deep in her work. The envelope had reached her friend at a private lab, and tests were already underway. Grace stayed close to her phone, checking it every few minutes. She'd seen too many cases where truth was buried by money, and she refused to let that happen again. Finally, one evening, her phone rang. She answered on the first ring. "Grace," the voice on the line said, "the DNA's not a match. The blood sample's from a woman, but not Sophia Hale." Grace closed her eyes, her chest tightening. Can you confirm the result? It's conclusive, the voice said. Whoever that stain belongs to, she's the real link to the theft. Grace thanked them, hung up, and exhaled. The result meant one thing: Sophia was innocent. But it also meant the truth would now hurt people with power, and power never surrendered easily. That night, Grace wrote down every detail in her case notes, making copies of the report in case something happened to her files. She knew exactly who needed to see it first. When morning came, Ethan Whitmore received her message. It was short: meet me after school. It's time. He waited anxiously all day, glancing at the classroom clock every few minutes. When the final bell rang, he ran straight toward Willow Creek Cottage, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. Grace was already outside, waiting by the gate. When she saw him, she smiled softly, not with joy, but with the calm certainty of someone holding proof that could change everything. The test results came back, she said. It's not Sophia's blood. It belongs to another woman. Ethan's hands trembled. So she's innocent? Grace nodded. Completely. But now we need to prove it where it matters. In court. Ethan's heart raced. Will you help her? Grace placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. I already am. Together they sat in the garden, planning their next step. Grace explained that the news had begun to spread. Reporters were revisiting the case, questioning how the trial had been handled so quickly. Back at Whitmore Manor, Charles had already noticed the shift. During breakfast, his butler, Mr. Allen, approached with a hesitant voice. Sir, there's a journalist waiting outside. He says he wants to speak about the court case. Charles frowned. Send him away. But Michael Trent, a well-known investigative reporter, didn't leave. He stood by the manor gate, speaking into his camera as a small crowd began to gather. New evidence may challenge the conviction of Sophia Hale, he said into the microphone. Sources suggest the case was rushed and may involve judicial misconduct. Inside the manor, Charles turned on the television just in time to see his own name appear on screen. Billionaire's trial under question. His grip tightened around the remote. Lydia, standing nearby, froze. The color drained from her face. What are they talking about? Charles demanded. She stammered. I don't know. Her voice cracked, betraying her fear. Charles studied her for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned and left the room. Upstairs, Ethan Whitmore watched the broadcast from his tablet, heart pounding. The truth was finally moving, and the world had started listening. Later that evening, he met with Grace Ellison once more in secret. The results were printed, sealed, and ready. She told him about the growing public pressure, about how the court was now being forced to review Sophia's sentence. It's working, Ethan said, barely able to contain his excitement. Grace nodded. But this is just the beginning. When the retrial comes, you'll need to be brave. He straightened his back. I will be. Over the next few days, tension wrapped itself around the Whitmore home like fog. Reporters camped outside the gates. Headlines filled the airwaves. Even the most loyal investors started keeping their distance. Charles Whitmore pretended not to care, but every morning his reflection looked heavier, pride crumbling under pressure, and one night, while passing by the living room, he heard something that made his heart stop. From behind the door came Lydia's voice, trembling, nervous, whispering into her phone. What if they find out about the cloth? Charles froze. The word hit him like lightning. The cloth, the very word that had haunted him since the theft. He stepped back silently, not wanting her to know he'd overheard. His pulse quickened, dread curling in his chest. Outside the same door, hidden behind a column, Ethan Whitmore sat with his small notebook, quietly listening. He wrote down every word his sister said. What if they find out about the cloth? His pencil pressed hard into the paper. He knew this moment mattered. He didn't know exactly how everything would end, but now he was certain of one thing. The truth was closer than ever. And this time, no one, Not his father, not the judge, not the lies, could stop it from coming out. The day after Charles Whitmore overheard his daughter's trembling words, the air inside Whitmore Manor felt different. Silence filled the hallways, but beneath it, fear pulsed like an unspoken heartbeat. Charles couldn't concentrate on anything. His meetings ended early, his calls grew short. The image of Lydia whispering, "What if they find out about the cloth?" replayed endlessly in his mind. That same morning, a black car rolled up to the gate. Out stepped Michael Trent, the investigative journalist who had refused to stay silent. The butler tried to turn him away, but Michael insisted. "Tell Mr. Whitmore this story's not going away," he said. Cameras flashed behind him. "He can either answer now or later, but we're publishing tonight." When Charles appeared at the door, Michael spoke calmly, his recorder already running. "Mr. Whitmore, reports say your trial with Sophia Hale lacked proper procedure. Sources claim Judge Preston has personal ties with you. Would you like to comment?" Charles's jaw tensed. "I have nothing to say to gossip." "Then why are the courts reopening the case?" Michael pressed. For the first time in years, Charles felt cornered, not by rivals, but by truth. He slammed the door shut and barked orders at his staff. No one lets the press inside. No statements. Nothing. Upstairs, Ethan Whitmore stood quietly by the railing, listening. His father's fury didn't scare him anymore. It confirmed something he already knew. Fear had changed sides. Later that evening, Ethan met with Grace Ellison once more at Willow Creek Cottage. The air smelled of rain and earth. They sat under the porch light, reviewing the lab's findings. Grace unfolded the document and placed it in front of him. The page bore a single line that changed everything. DNA confirmed female origin, non-match to Sophia Hale. Ethan traced the words with his small finger. "So it's real now." "No one can deny it," Grace nodded. "We have proof, Ethan. But truth alone doesn't win. It needs to be heard." She paused before adding, "The retrial's been scheduled for next week. The public wants answers, and this time the court can't silence it." Ethan's heart pounded. "Can I go?" "You should," she said. "But be ready. It'll be hard to face them, especially your father." He didn't hesitate. "I'm ready." At Whitmore Manor, the pressure was turning into chaos. Lydia barely came out of her room. Clara Whitmore tried to keep peace between father and children, but even she sensed the storm approaching. One evening, Lydia sat by her mirror, her eyes red from crying. She stared at her reflection, the daughter of power, dressed in guilt. The cut on her palm had nearly healed, but the bandage remained like a reminder. Down the hall, Ethan watched her quietly. He wanted to speak, to ask her why she'd done it, but something held him back. He knew the truth had to come out in its own time. Meanwhile, across the city, Grace Ellison and her contacts were preparing. She met with a young lawyer willing to represent Sophia in the retrial, Mark Layton, someone unafraid of reputation or money. "The evidence speaks for itself," Mark said confidently. "Once we present it, the entire case collapses." Grace nodded, though she knew the battle would still be brutal. Powerful men rarely let the truth walk free without resistance. By the time the week ended, the story had already made national headlines. Billionaire's Maid's trial under fire, possible corruption in Ravenshire court. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, holding signs that read, "Justice for Sophia and no one above the law." The city buzzed with anticipation, and through it all, Ethan waited quietly, holding onto the white cloth, now sealed in a transparent bag. Proof of everything that had been stolen, not just from Sophia, but from their family's humanity. When the morning of the retrial finally arrived, Ravenshire Courthouse was a storm of flashing cameras, reporters, and whispers. The crowd parted as Sophia Hale stepped out of the van, escorted by officers. Her face was pale, her eyes tired, but her spirit stood taller than ever. Years of fear had hardened into strength. Beside her, Mark Layton carried the documents, and Grace Ellison walked with calm authority. Then the crowd's attention shifted toward a sleek black limousine pulling up beside the steps. Out came Charles Whitmore, his expression unreadable. Beside him walked Lydia, silent and trembling. But before the cameras could turn fully toward them, another small figure stepped out from the sidewalk. Ethan Whitmore. Holding Grace's hand, the reporters gasped. The billionaire's son, standing beside the woman his father had condemned. Inside the courthouse, the tension was suffocating. The same courtroom where Sophia had once been humiliated was now filled with cameras, journalists, and citizens demanding justice. Judge Preston sat at the bench again, but his face betrayed unease. The world was watching now, and his power to manipulate had vanished. Sophia sat quietly beside her new lawyer. Grace stood nearby with her evidence. Ethan sat behind them, eyes locked on his father. When the hearing began, Judge Preston tried to sound calm, but his voice faltered. "This court reconvenes to review the conviction of Sophia Hale," he announced. "All parties present?" "Yes, Your Honor," Mark said firmly. The retrial started like the first one had. Procedure, statements, formalities. But this time the room felt different. Truth had weight now. Sophia's lawyer raised his voice. "Your Honor, we have newly verified evidence, DNA results that directly contradict the prosecution's claim." Judge Preston frowned. "Evidence from where?" Grace stepped forward. "From the original crime scene, Your Honor. A white cloth used during the theft." The crowd stirred. Cameras clicked. Charles shifted in his seat, jaw tight. Judge Preston leaned forward. "And who authorized this examination?" Before Grace could answer, a small voice rose from the gallery. "I did." Every head turned. Ethan Whitmore stood, clutching the clear bag with the white cloth inside. His voice was soft but steady. "I asked for the test, because no one else would." Gasps filled the room. Charles turned sharply, his face draining of color. "Ethan, sit down," he hissed, but Ethan didn't move. He looked directly at the judge. "That cloth has blood on it, but it's not Sophia's. You can test it again if you want." Grace placed her hand on his shoulder. "He's telling the truth." The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Judge Preston hesitated, unsure whether to continue or call for recess. The audience leaned forward, waiting for his reaction. Ethan raised the bag higher, his voice trembling with emotion. "You all believed a lie, and now I'm showing you the truth." For a few long seconds, no one in the courtroom moved. The silence felt alive, trembling with disbelief. Every camera pointed toward the boy standing bravely at the center of it all, Ethan Whitmore, 6 years old, holding truth in his tiny hands. Judge Preston blinked, startled. His voice wavered as he tried to regain control. "Young man, you can't—" But Grace Ellison interrupted firmly. "Your Honor, let him speak. The truth doesn't always wear a suit." The crowd erupted with murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even the guards by the doors exchanged uncertain glances. Charles Whitmore sat frozen in the front row, eyes locked on his son. His face was pale, jaw clenched. His empire, his pride, was unraveling through the voice of a child. Ethan took a shaky breath and stepped closer to the bench. His voice, though small, carried the weight of courage far beyond his years. "I saw that cloth in my father's office. It was hidden behind a cabinet. It has a blood stain on it." Judge Preston frowned. "You're suggesting your father?" Ethan shook his head quickly. "Not my father. My sister, Lydia." A sharp gasp cut through the room. Reporters leaned forward. Cameras flashed in a strobe of chaos. Lydia's trembling hands gripped her chair. "Ethan, stop!" she cried, her voice breaking. But Ethan didn't stop. "I saw her holding something wrapped in that same white cloth the day the watch went missing. I didn't understand then, but now I do. She cut herself. That's why there's blood." The entire room seemed to tilt under the weight of his words. Grace Ellison stepped forward, her calm presence commanding attention. "Your Honor, this cloth was tested by an independent forensic lab. The DNA belongs to a female and not Sophia Hale. The test is verified and the report is here." She handed over the envelope. The court officer carried it to the judge, who opened it with trembling hands. As Judge Preston read, the color drained from his face. His lips tightened. The document was authentic, and it destroyed everything his earlier ruling had built. Sophia sat still, tears spilling quietly down her cheeks. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched, her heart pounding with the fragile hope that maybe finally someone would believe her. Grace continued, her voice unwavering. Sophia Hale was convicted without evidence, without defense, and without fairness. This new DNA test proves she was innocent all along. The real stain was never on her hands. It was on the justice system that failed her. Applause broke from the audience, then hushed again as the judge struck his gavel. But he couldn't silence the truth anymore. Charles Whitmore rose slowly from his seat. His face was pale, his expression a storm of fear, shame, and disbelief. His eyes darted toward Lydia, whose body had gone rigid. "Lydia," he whispered, almost pleading. She looked up, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean to, Father. I swear I didn't mean to." Her voice cracked as she stood. "I only wanted to see it, the watch. I wanted to show my friends. I thought it was beautiful. When I opened the case, I cut my hand. I panicked." Her confession shattered the courtroom. Sophia covered her mouth, shaking silently. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling relief mixed with exhaustion. Lydia continued, sobbing openly now. "I was scared. I hid the watch in my drawer. I thought no one would find out. When you accused Sophia, I wanted to tell you the truth, but you looked so angry. I didn't know how." The judge's gavel struck again, but no one was listening. The air was filled with the sound of whispered shock. Reporters rushing to the hallway to send headlines that would soon sweep the country. Billionaire's daughter confesses in court. Maid declared innocent. Judge Preston sat back, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted his glasses. "This court," he said slowly, "acknowledges the presented evidence and confession. The charges against Sophia Hale are hereby dismissed." The words hung in the air, soft yet monumental. Sophia froze, unable to breathe for a moment. Then her body collapsed forward as tears poured freely. The guard beside her quietly unlocked her handcuffs. The courtroom erupted in applause, reporters standing, citizens clapping. Even court officers unable to hold back emotion. For the first time in years, Sophia smiled. It was faint, broken, but real. Grace wrapped an arm around her. "It's over," she whispered. "You're free." But for Charles Whitmore, the word over felt like punishment. He looked at his daughter, now crying uncontrollably in front of everyone. He looked at Ethan, the boy who had destroyed the lie he'd built his world upon. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "What have I done?" He sat down heavily, burying his face in his hands as cameras flashed. The reporters swarmed the steps outside moments later. "Mr. Whitmore, did you know your daughter was involved? Will you compensate Sophia Hale?" He said nothing. His silence was his first act of truth. Outside, Sophia emerged from the courthouse surrounded by light and sound. Microphones pushed toward her. People cheered. For once, her name wasn't followed by shame. It was followed by justice. Ethan stood at her side, clutching her hand tightly. He looked up at her and said softly, "I told you I'd fix it." Sophia smiled through her tears. "You did, Ethan. You did what no one else dared." The country watched as the moment played on live television. The image of a woman wronged, a child brave enough to speak, and a man finally realizing the cost of his pride. And inside the courthouse, Charles Whitmore sat motionless, tears silently tracing down his face. The world had forgiven his money before, but this time it wasn't his wealth that spoke. It was the absence of it. He had lost something greater than reputation. He had lost his son's trust, and that, he realized, was a debt no amount of power could ever repay. The courtroom was still buzzing long after the gavel struck for the final time. Reporters were on their phones, shouting updates to their teams. Cameras rolled endlessly, catching every tear, every trembling word. But amidst the chaos, Sophia Hale sat still. For years, she had been a prisoner, not only behind bars, but inside the silence forced upon her. Now that silence was broken, replaced by the quiet power of vindication, the guard beside her spoke gently. "You're free to go, ma'am." She nodded slowly, her mind trying to accept words she never thought she'd hear again. Across the room, Charles Whitmore stood like a man waking from a nightmare. His eyes were red, his posture defeated. Lydia clung to him, her sobs muffled against his chest. The cameras captured every second, the mighty family brought to its knees by the truth of its own sins. Judge Preston shuffled his papers awkwardly, his voice strained as he made one last official statement. "The record will reflect this dismissal and the subsequent confession. Ms. Hale is hereby released with immediate effect." His gaze briefly met Charles's, a silent acknowledgement that both of their reputations were shattered. The judge's hand trembled slightly. His long-standing alliance with the Whitmores had ended in disgrace. Grace Ellison helped Sophia to her feet. "Let's go," she whispered. "You've spent enough time in this place." They walked toward the exit together. As the heavy doors opened, sunlight poured in, bright, blinding, almost holy. Outside, the crowd erupted in cheers. Reporters pushed microphones forward, shouting questions. "Sophia, what are your next steps? Will you press charges against the Whitmore family? How does it feel to be free?" Sophia didn't answer. She simply raised her head to the light, closed her eyes, and took a long breath, her first as a truly free woman. Beside her, Ethan Whitmore stood quietly, his small hand holding hers. The cameras zoomed in on the unlikely pair, the maid who had been framed, and the billionaire's 6-year-old son who had saved her. The crowd hushed as Sophia finally spoke, her voice steady but soft. "Justice doesn't erase pain, but it can stop the bleeding." The words spread like wildfire across every news channel. That night, the world changed its tone. Headlines read, "Billionaire's son exposes truth. Innocent maid freed after years of injustice." For days, news anchors debated ethics, power, and pride. Social media flooded with support for Sophia Hale. She had become a symbol of resilience, while the Whitmore name, once synonymous with prestige, now carried a different weight. Inside Whitmore Manor, silence had taken hold again. But this time it wasn't the silence of control. It was the silence of consequence. Charles Whitmore sat in his office, surrounded by shadows. The gold-framed portraits of ancestors on the walls felt like judgment. He looked at the empty space where the glass case once stood, where the watch had lain for decades, and felt something collapse inside him. He had built his empire on legacy, but in his blind pursuit to protect it, he had destroyed the very values that made it worth anything. For hours, he sat alone, remembering Sophia's tears in that courtroom, remembering Ethan's trembling voice, remembering Lydia's confession. When Ethan entered quietly, Charles didn't speak. The boy walked closer, clutching his small notebook, the same one he'd used to record every detail of the truth. He placed it gently on the desk. "It's all written here," he said softly. "Everything that really happened." Charles stared at him, eyes heavy with regret. "Ethan," he began, voice cracking, But Ethan interrupted, not unkindly. "You didn't believe her, and you didn't believe me." Charles looked away, ashamed. After a long pause, Ethan added, "I still want to believe you can change." Then he turned and walked away, leaving his father alone with the weight of those words. Upstairs, Clara Whitmore stood outside Lydia's door. The girl hadn't spoken since the hearing. She sat by the window, staring out at the grey horizon. When her mother entered, Lydia whispered, "Mum, is it always this hard to tell the truth?" Clara brushed her hair gently. "Sometimes it is, but silence hurts more." Lydia nodded slowly, tears forming again. Across the city, Grace Ellison sat in her small cottage, filing away the case documents. The forensic report, the photos, the transcripts, everything that had once been hidden was now public record. Her phone buzzed with messages from journalists and lawyers, all asking for interviews. She ignored them. The story belonged to Sophia now, and in a quiet apartment provided by Grace, Sophia Hale finally began to rebuild. The first night outside the prison felt unreal. She made herself tea, sat by the window, and simply listened. To wind, to passing cars, to the sound of freedom. When the news came on, she muted it. She didn't need to watch the world talk about her pain anymore. What mattered wasn't the noise outside. It was the peace returning inside. Still, she thought of Ethan, the little boy who had risked everything to speak the truth. She smiled faintly, whispering to herself, "He's the reason I survived this." At that exact moment, across Ravenshire, Ethan lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet. The moonlight traced silver lines across his room. For the first time in a long while, he felt something close to calm. He didn't know what the future would bring, but he knew this. He had done what was right. Downstairs, Charles sat in darkness, still awake. He picked up the pocket watch from his desk, the one Lydia had returned through tears earlier that day. The glass was cracked, the metal stained faintly. He turned it over in his hands, whispering to himself, "It's not time that matters, it's what we do with it." And as the clock ticked softly, for the first time in his life, Charles Whitmore wished he could turn it back. The following days were filled with endless headlines and interviews. Every news channel replayed the same courtroom footage. Sophia Hale standing free, Ethan Whitmore holding her hand, Charles Whitmore watching in silence. Everyone expected the story to end with legal retaliation. Lawyers across Ravenshire predicted lawsuits, compensation demands, or even criminal charges. But when Sophia was asked about it during a press conference, her answer silenced the entire room. "I don't want revenge," she said simply. "I want peace." Her voice didn't shake. Her eyes didn't wander. She looked straight at the cameras, calm and unwavering. "Hate doesn't heal. It only chains us again." The words spread across the country like wildfire. Social media exploded. Some praised her grace, others called her naive. But Sophia didn't care what people thought. She had lived through pain deeper than public opinion. Back at Ravenshire Courthouse, the judge sat in private session with his advisors, stunned by her choice. She forgave him? He whispered to himself. No one could answer. Forgiveness wasn't something they could record in legal documents. Meanwhile, inside Whitmore Manor, Charles watched the televised moment over and over. Every time Sophia said the word forgive, his heart clenched harder. For a man who had spent his life controlling outcomes, forgiveness was something he couldn't command. He could only hope for. When reporters approached his car the next morning, asking whether he planned to appeal or counter the dismissal, Charles did something unexpected. He stopped walking. He turned to the cameras and said quietly, "I don't plan to fight anything. I plan to listen." It was the first honest statement he had made in years. Later that evening, he sat in his office again, the gold watch resting on the desk. It looked dull now, its brilliance faded, like it too carried guilt. When Ethan entered, Charles didn't look up right away. The boy stood by the door, hesitant. Finally, Charles said, "I was wrong." Ethan didn't respond. Charles continued, "I failed Sophia. I failed Lydia, and I failed you." His voice broke. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed to say it." For a long moment, Ethan just stared. Then he walked closer and said softly, "You can fix things, not with words, but with what you do next." Charles nodded slowly. "Then I'll start now." The next morning, he wrote a personal letter to Sophia Hale, not on company letterhead, not dictated by lawyers, but handwritten. The ink smudged in places where his hands shook. "Sophia, I destroyed what I didn't understand. You showed me what power really means. I can't undo what I've done, but I can choose what comes after. Thank you for forgiving what I never would have." He signed it and left it unsealed, as if the gesture itself needed to breathe. When Sophia received the letter later that week, she didn't reply. She didn't need to. Forgiveness, she believed, wasn't a conversation. It was a release. Days turned into weeks. The noise of the scandal began to fade. The world, ever hungry for new stories, moved on. But for the people at the heart of it, the healing had just begun. Lydia Whitmore started attending therapy. She avoided the press, rarely leaving the house. But one afternoon she asked her father quietly, "Can I apologize to her?" Charles looked at her, eyes soft. "If you mean it, yes." Weeks later they met in a quiet cafe near Willow Creek. No cameras, no reporters. Just three people carrying the weight of their choices. Lydia's voice trembled. "I ruined your life." Sophia shook her head. "You were scared." "I've been scared too," Lydia cried, but Sophia reached across the table and took her hand. "We both lost years to fear. Let's not lose the rest to guilt." It wasn't reconciliation through words. It was through the fragile human silence that follows truth. Later, Charles began taking steps of his own. He called a press conference, though not to defend himself. Standing before dozens of reporters, he said plainly, "I am not here to protect my name. I'm here to correct it." He announced that he was stepping down from the Whitmore board, relinquishing his chair to an independent body. Then he took a breath and made one more statement that stunned the room. "I will transfer a significant part of my personal assets to Sophia Hale. This isn't charity, it's correction. It's justice delayed, not denied." Questions erupted instantly. "Are you being forced to do this? Is this to rebuild your image?" Charles shook his head. "No one's forcing me. I'm doing it because forgiveness deserves action." The footage spread nationwide. Some praised him. Others doubted his sincerity. But for the first time in years, Charles didn't care how people judged him. He had finally learned what Sophia already knew. Truth doesn't need approval. When the news reached her, Sophia smiled faintly and whispered, "He's learning." But instead of spending the money on herself, she began to build something new. A few months later, a banner hung above a modest building at the edge of Ravenshire City, the Hale Foundation for Women, rebuilding lives, restoring dignity. Inside, Sophia taught classes on resilience, financial literacy, and ethics, lessons she had learned not from books, but from surviving injustice. And when it came time to name the main hall, she didn't call it after herself. She named it the Ethan Hall. When Ethan visited for the first time, his face lit up. "You didn't have to," he said shyly. Sophia smiled. "You did more for truth at 6 than most people do in a lifetime. The least I can do is remind others that courage has no age." From that day, Ethan often helped at the foundation after school, organizing supplies, painting walls, listening to women tell their stories. He didn't say much, but when he did, people listened. Meanwhile, Charles Whitmore kept his promise. He visited the foundation sometimes quietly, not as a donor, but as a helper. He swept floors, carried boxes, and listened more than he spoke. He didn't ask for thanks. Sophia never gave speeches about his redemption. They both understood that true change is quiet. It happens in how you show up, not what you say. And for the first time in years, the Whitmore name began to mean something different. Not power, not wealth, but humility. A full year passed since that day in court, the day truth shattered lies and forgiveness rewrote power. Ravenshire City had long moved on to new stories, But for the Whitmore family, the echoes of that trial still shaped every breath. Charles Whitmore lived quietly now. He had stepped away from boardrooms, headlines, and luxury dinners. His mansion no longer hosted lavish events. The grand halls that once echoed with arrogance now held quiet conversations, small laughter, and sometimes silence, but peaceful silence this time. Every morning, Charles walked through the gardens with a simple broom in his hand. He no longer gave orders to the gardeners. He worked alongside them. He didn't need to prove humility. He was learning it, one act at a time. When people in town recognized him, they often whispered or stared. Some pitied him, some admired him. He never tried to explain himself anymore. He just smiled faintly and said, "I'm learning what really matters." Across the city, Sophia Hale's foundation thrived. The small building that once looked modest had turned into a living symbol of change. Women from across the country came seeking not charity, but strength, and they left with it. The walls were lined with handprints of those who had graduated through her programs, each one representing a story of survival and rebirth. In one corner of the main hall hung a framed photograph, a picture of a 6-year-old boy standing beside Sophia, both smiling shyly after the trial. The caption beneath read, "Justice doesn't come from power. It comes from courage." Every time Sophia walked past it, she smiled. Not because it reminded her of pain, but because it reminded her that truth, once spoken, can change everything. Ethan Whitmore, now a year older, often visited after school. He'd carry notebooks, help with supplies, or read stories to younger children who attended weekend sessions. He was still quiet, but his silence no longer came from fear. It came from thoughtfulness. He had become the foundation's quiet symbol, a reminder that even innocence can carry strength. One afternoon, during the Institute's anniversary event, Sophia asked him to give a short speech. He hesitated at first, fidgeting with the paper in his hands. The crowd was full, volunteers, former students, and a few journalists who had come to cover the foundation's success. Sophia smiled encouragingly from the front row. Ethan stepped forward, his small voice steadying as he spoke. "A year ago, I thought adults always knew what was right. I thought truth was simple, but I learned that even grown-ups can be afraid of it, and that sometimes it takes someone small to say what's real." He paused, scanning the audience. "Sophia once told me courage doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you don't stop because you are." The crowd fell silent. No applause yet, just quiet, moved listening. He looked toward his father, who sat near the back, eyes glistening. "My dad taught me what happens when you forget what matters. And Sophia taught me what happens when you remember." Now the applause came. Warm, human, genuine. Cameras flashed, but Ethan didn't care. He smiled shyly and stepped back, his words landing deeper than he realized. After the event, as people mingled, Charles Whitmore approached Sophia slowly. His once commanding presence was gone, replaced by something gentler, something real. "You built something beautiful," he said quietly. Sophia looked at him for a long moment before replying. "It was built out of what broke us," he nodded. "Then maybe breaking wasn't the worst thing that happened." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned toward the window, watching the students laughing outside in the courtyard. "No," she said softly, "it wasn't." Charles hesitated, then asked, "Would you let me help here?" Sophia turned to him with a small smile. "You already are, just by showing up." From that day, Charles became a silent volunteer at the foundation. He didn't sit on boards or make speeches. He swept the floors, fixed the lights, served food, and listened to the women tell their stories. No one called him Sir anymore, and for the first time in his life, he didn't miss it. Weeks later, Grace Ellison visited the foundation, carrying a new case file under her arm. "You've done something remarkable here," she told Sophia. "But I think you're just getting started," Sophia smiled. It's not me. It's everyone who decided to stand back up. Grace placed a hand on her shoulder. Still, you remind the world that truth doesn't end in a courtroom. It begins there. That evening, as the sun dipped over Ravenshire, Sophia walked alone through the empty halls. The light from the windows bathed everything in gold. The sound of distant laughter echoed from the courtyard. She stopped by the framed photo of herself and Ethan again. Her fingers brushed the glass. It wasn't pride she felt. It was peace. Meanwhile, outside, Charles stood by the foundation's gate, watching Ethan help paint a new sign with the other children. He smiled faintly, eyes misty. Clara Whitmore approached him, holding 2 cups of coffee. "He's happy," she said softly. Charles nodded. "He's free." She looked at him for a long moment. "So are you." He didn't answer, but she was right. When the sky darkened, Charles looked once more toward the glowing windows of the foundation. Inside, Sophia was locking up for the night. Their eyes met through the glass. She gave a small nod, one of acknowledgement, not friendship or forgiveness, but something greater, understanding. He nodded back. As she turned off the final light, the reflection of both of them disappeared into the night. 2 people bound not by history, but by what they had chosen to become after it. Months later, the world had nearly forgotten the scandal, but in one corner of Ravenshire, a building stood quietly, lit by hope instead of wealth. On its entrance door was a simple plaque engraved with Sophia's words, "Justice is not about punishment. It's about restoration," and below it, in smaller letters, "Dedicated to those who spoke when silence was easier." At sunrise, the city stirred awake. Buses hummed, markets opened, and inside the foundation, laughter began again. Sophia Hale walked through the doors she had built from the ruins of her pain. Charles Whitmore arrived an hour later, broom in hand. Ethan greeted him with a smile. The story that began with accusation had ended in understanding and begun again in purpose. Because sometimes life's most powerful justice isn't revenge. It's change. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. If you've stayed with us till now, thank you, truly. Stories like this remind us that truth, forgiveness, and courage still matter, even when the world forgets them. I hope this one made you feel something real. Tell us in the comment below what part touched you the most, or what moment broke your heart. Your words mean more than you think. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss the next story that makes you stop and think. Until next time,